I saw it clear as day, 12 feet tall, hair black as pitch, eyes burning yellow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool.
What if the tide didn't just take, but remember?
It was 1884. A Canadian newspaper called The British Colonist ran a story that stopped readers cold. A creature had been captured near Yale, British Columbia, along the Fraser River. It was described as half man, half beast. Covered in coarse black hair, only 4 feet 7 inches tall, but with a chest like a barrel and the strength of several men. They called it Jacko. And here's the thing. This wasn't some tabloid fringe publication. This was a respected regional newspaper of record. And Jacko was just one of dozens of hairy wild man reports printed across North American newspapers throughout the 1800s. So where did these stories come from? Were they hoaxes, cultural memory, or something else entirely? Today, we're going back to the era of fur traders, frontier settlers, and newspaper editors to trace the wild man legend at its most raw and documented. 1. Setting the stage. To understand these reports, you have to understand the world that produced them. The early 19th century Pacific Northwest was, from a European-American perspective, genuinely unmapped. The Columbia River wasn't fully charted until the 1840s. The Cascade Range interior was largely unknown to settlers until well after that. And the fur trade, which brought men like David Thompson, Simon Fraser, and Alexander Mackenzie into these territories from the late 1700s onward, pushed Europeans into landscapes they had absolutely no framework for. These men were not tourists. They were hardened, practical professionals. Trappers, surveyors, company men working for the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. They wrote field journals intended for institutional record, not for campfire ghost stories. Which is exactly why what David Thompson wrote in 1811 is so remarkable. Thompson was one of the greatest land surveyors in North American history. He mapped nearly 4 million square kilometers of North America, a meticulous man, a man of science. And yet, in January of 1811, near what is now Jasper, Alberta, at the edge of the Athabasca Pass, Thompson recorded finding enormous footprints in the snow. He described them as 14 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 4 toes each tipped with what appeared to be claws. In his journal, he wrote that his men were deeply unsettled, some refusing to continue. Thompson himself remained professionally skeptical, but he recorded it faithfully. No explanation, no punchline. It is one of the earliest documented accounts by a named European explorer of what we would now call a Bigfoot track. The newspaper explosion. By the mid to late 1800s, something interesting was happening. As settlers moved west into Washington Territory, Oregon, Northern California, and British Columbia, the newspaper industry boomed alongside them. And with it came a wave of wild man reports that is, frankly, staggering in volume when you go looking for it. Let's walk through some of the most notable accounts. The Ape Canyon Precursors. In 1870, a California newspaper reported that a gorilla-like man had been spotted near Crow Canyon in Contra Costa County. The witness described it as walking upright, immensely tall, and covered in dark fur. The account was brief, but it fit a pattern already beginning to crystallize. The Oregon accounts. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, Oregon newspapers, particularly those serving the Willamette Valley and the coastal ranges, printed intermittent wild man reports. Loggers were a common source. Men working timber camps in the Coast Range described nighttime disturbances, tree branches snapping, enormous shapes glimpsed through tree lines. the occasional discovery of crushed undergrowth suggesting something very large had bedded down. One 1879 account from a small Oregon paper described a creature seen near the Umpqua River that stood erect upon two legs, was clothed in a thick coat of brown hair, and retreated into the timber with a speed no horse could match. The Yale, British Columbia case, 1884. We return now to Jacko, because this is the account that historians and researchers have spent the most time with. The Daily Colonist of Victoria, British Columbia, ran the story on July 4, 1884. According to the account, a train crew on the Canadian Pacific Railway spotted a creature lying beside the tracks near Yale. They gave chase and, after some effort, captured it by cutting off its escape route on a cliff face. Jacko, the name they gave it, was reportedly taken to Yale and held for public display. The paper described him as resembling a gorilla, covered in glossy black hair, with enormous forearm strength, and a diet of berries and milk. The story then vanishes. No follow-up. No record of Jacko being transported to a city, shown publicly, or scientifically examined. Researchers have never found a subsequent report confirming his existence. Was Jacko a hoax? A circus animal? A misidentified bear? Or was the follow-up simply never printed? We don't know. And that ambiguity is, in many ways, the perfect encapsulation of the entire genre.
European wild man. Here's where the story gets even more interesting, because the settlers arriving in the Pacific Northwest brought something with them. Something invisible, but powerful. A folklore tradition going back over 1,000 years. The wild man of the woods, Homo sylvestris in Latin, Waldmensch in German, is one of the most persistent figures in European mythology. He appears in medieval manuscripts from the 10th century onward. He shows up in German carnival processions. He's on Swiss heraldic crests. He decorates the margins of illuminated Bibles. This figure has consistent characteristics across dozens of cultures and centuries. He is large, hairy, immensely strong, and lives at the boundary between civilization and the untamed wilderness. He is sometimes threatening, sometimes wise, sometimes simply a mirror, a reflection of what humans fear they might become without society. The wild man appeared in Renaissance paintings and Elizabethan drama. Shakespeare's Caliban in The Tempest is a wild man figure. So is the green man found carved into European churches. By the time European settlers were crossing the Atlantic and eventually the Rocky Mountains, this archetype was baked into their cultural DNA. They had a cognitive category ready and waiting for any large, hair-covered bipedal creature they might encounter. Split screen, medieval woodcut of wild man / 19th century newspaper illustration of wild man nut. And this is the scholarly tension at the heart of these accounts. How much of what settlers reported was filtered through this pre-existing template? When a logger in 1875 Oregon said he saw something like a great hairy man, was he describing observed reality or reaching for the only available vocabulary? The answer is almost certainly both. There is one element that 19th century newspaper accounts almost universally ignored, and which complicates the European import theory considerably. The salespeople of British Columbia spoke of Sasquatch, a powerful being associated with the forest and with spiritual transformation. The word, filtered through English phonetics, eventually became Sasquatch. The Lummi, the Lakapammix, the Hulkamalam-speaking peoples all had related beings in their traditions. These were not identical to the newspaper wild man. They were often spiritual entities as much as physical ones. But they occupied similar conceptual territory. Large, liminal, existing at the threshold between the human world and the wild. When settlers encountered these indigenous accounts, they didn't always recognize the depth of what they were hearing. They folded it into their own framework, the wild man of the woods, and printed it in their newspapers as curiosity or sensation. The result was a strange cultural fusion, European archetype meeting indigenous oral tradition, mediated by frontier journalism. So what is the honest historian's take on all of this? Several things can be true simultaneously. First, many 19th century newspaper wild man stories were almost certainly fabricated or wildly embellished. Frontier journalism had virtually no fact-checking standards. Editors printed sensational stories to sell papers. Hoaxes were common and considered, at the time, essentially harmless entertainment. The Jacko story almost certainly falls into this category. Or at minimum, into a category of significant embellishment. Second, some accounts likely describe real animal encounters that were misidentified or exaggerated. Bears, walking upright when threatened or curious, can be startlingly anthropomorphic at a distance. A black bear in fog, glimpsed through a tree line by an already nervous trapper, that can become a wild man by the time the story reaches a newspaper desk. Third, the European wild man archetype was doing real cognitive work in these accounts. Settlers were moving into landscapes that were genuinely disorienting, vast, dark, ecologically alien. The wild man was a way of naming that unease. Of giving shape to the formless danger of a landscape that did not yet belong to them. And fourth, and this is the part that keeps researchers genuinely curious, David Thompson's footprints don't fit neatly into any of those categories. Thompson was not a sensationalist. He had no incentive to fabricate. And his account predates the peak of Pacific Northwest wildman newspaper coverage by decades. It sits there, in his expedition journals, unexplained. The 19th century wild man reports are a remarkable document of a particular historical moment, a collision of European folklore, indigenous knowledge, frontier anxiety, and sensationalist journalism. They didn't create the Bigfoot legend from nothing. But they did crystallize it. They gave it a shape in print, a vocabulary in English, a presence in the popular imagination.